Do you even have a degree? The question landed so casually that most people at the table smiled without thinking twice. But before the afternoon was over, those 7 words would echo through a boardroom where silence carried more weight than applause. The lunch crowd at Hawthorne House moved with the polished rhythm of Manhattan's business elite, crystal glasses catching the noon sunlight, while conversations about mergers, quarterly forecasts, and market expansion floated beneath the soft notes of a grand piano. Naomi Carter navigated the dining room with practiced grace, balancing a polished tray in one hand while greeting every guest with the same quiet professionalism that had become second nature after 3 years of serving executives who rarely noticed the people refilling their water glasses. She never hurried, yet she never seemed late. She never interrupted, yet somehow every table received exactly what it needed before asking. To most customers, she was simply another waitress in a neatly pressed black uniform. Invisible, replaceable, easy to overlook. Ethan Whitmore arrived 12 minutes behind schedule, followed by 6 members of Whitmore Technologies' executive leadership team. At 39, he had built a reputation as one of the country's most respected CEOs, admired for transforming struggling companies into billion-dollar success stories. Investors trusted his instincts. Employees admired his discipline. Competitors feared his precision. He believed excellence could be measured, verified, and documented. Degrees, certifications, performance reviews. Every accomplishment deserved proof. Every expert deserved credentials. It was a philosophy that had rarely failed him. As the executives settled into the private dining room overlooking Central Park, Naomi greeted each guest with the same composed smile. Coffee, sparkling water, still water, dietary requests carefully noted. Every detail committed to memory without writing a single word until everyone had spoken. Ethan barely looked up from the financial presentation glowing on his tablet. His attention stayed fixed on charts, projections, and acquisition numbers until Naomi quietly placed his black coffee beside him exactly the way he preferred it after only one previous visit months earlier. He paused for just a fraction of a second. Then his eyes narrowed with mild curiosity. You remembered. Naomi simply nodded. Some details are worth remembering, sir. The meeting continued while lunch was served. Revenue forecasts, hiring strategies, international expansion. Around the table, opinions clashed politely as executives debated a proposal involving a university research partnership. One vice president insisted academic credentials should determine who led the initiative. Another argued that practical experience mattered more. Ethan listened without speaking until the conversation naturally drifted toward the people who represented the company. Almost absent-mindedly, he glanced toward Naomi as she refilled a water glass. Tell me something, he said, his voice calm enough that no one immediately sensed the weight behind the question. Do you even have a degree? Every fork stopped moving. The room remained perfectly still. Naomi slowly placed the glass back onto the linen tablecloth. She met Ethan's eyes without hesitation, without embarrassment, and without anger. Then she offered an answer so simple, so measured, and so unexpectedly confident that before anyone realized what had happened, the conversation itself had quietly changed direction. Naomi did not answer immediately. Instead, she folded her hands lightly in front of her apron, the same way she always did whenever she wanted to give someone her full attention. Her expression never changed. No embarrassment crossed her face. No irritation reached her eyes. Around the table, several executives exchanged uncomfortable glances, expecting either an awkward apology or an attempt to avoid the question altogether. Neither came. Yes, Naomi said softly. I do. Her voice was calm enough that the words almost disappeared beneath the clinking silverware from the dining room outside the private suite. Ethan studied her for another second before leaning back in his chair. Interesting, he replied. Because experience has taught me that people usually mention their education long before anyone has to ask. A faint smile appeared on Naomi's face, not defensive, not sarcastic, simply thoughtful. Sometimes people prefer to let their work introduce them first. One executive quietly lowered his coffee cup. Another stopped scrolling through financial reports on his tablet. The conversation had shifted without anyone noticing exactly when it happened. Ethan folded his hands on the polished walnut table. He had spent his entire career reading people within minutes. confidence, insecurity, ambition, fear. Patterns revealed themselves quickly to those willing to observe. Yet the young waitress standing before him did not fit any pattern he recognized. She carried herself with unusual composure, almost as though she felt perfectly comfortable inside a room full of corporate leaders discussing transactions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. That confidence intrigued him more than her answer. Naomi politely excused herself to deliver another order across the dining room. She walked away with the same steady pace she had maintained all afternoon, never looking back to see whether anyone continued watching her. They did. Confident, one board member finally muttered. Another executive shrugged. Or rehearsed. Ethan said nothing. His eyes followed Naomi as she moved between tables, remembering names, anticipating requests before customers voiced them, quietly solving problems that never became visible to anyone else. At one corner booth, she noticed an elderly couple searching for reading glasses before they even asked, and gently handed them a complimentary menu printed in larger text. At another table, she reminded a guest about a severe nut allergy from a visit nearly 6 months earlier, preventing an unnecessary mistake without drawing attention to herself. She treated every customer exactly the same. Young professionals, retired veterans, families celebrating birthdays, wealthy investors discussing billion-dollar acquisitions. Every conversation received equal respect. There was no performance in her kindness, only consistency. Ethan had built companies around identifying exceptional talent, and one lesson had shaped nearly every successful decision he had ever made. Extraordinary habits revealed extraordinary people long before impressive resumes did. He had seen brilliant graduates fail because they lacked discipline. He had seen self-taught entrepreneurs outperform decorated executives because they never stopped learning. Yet something about Naomi suggested an entirely different category. She displayed neither ambition nor hesitation. She seemed completely at peace with wherever life had placed her, and somehow that quiet confidence felt far more unusual than confidence built on titles or prestige. Across the room, Naomi paused beside a service station to organize fresh coffee cups with careful precision. One younger server hurried past, accidentally dropping a stack of folded napkins onto the floor. Before the embarrassed employee could kneel, Naomi calmly gathered every napkin, smiled, and whispered something that made the young woman laugh with relief instead of panic. The moment lasted less than 10 seconds, but Ethan noticed it. Leadership, he thought, rarely announced itself. Sometimes it looked exactly like that. The lunch meeting resumed, but the rhythm of the room had changed in ways that could not be measured on a balance sheet. Numbers still appeared across glowing laptop screens. Charts still filled the projector display mounted against the far wall. Yet every few minutes, someone's attention drifted toward the dining room, where Naomi continued serving guests as though nothing unusual had happened. She neither hurried nor slowed her pace. She laughed softly with a family celebrating an anniversary. She helped an elderly gentleman fold his walker before escorting him to a quieter table near the window. Then she returned to polishing coffee cups with the same quiet focus that had marked every movement since the beginning of her shift. Ethan noticed something else. She never looked toward the executive table, searching for approval. She had already moved on. "Let us continue," he finally said, bringing the board's attention back to the acquisition proposal. "We are losing time." The presentation resumed. Melissa Grant, the company's chief financial officer, projected revised market forecasts onto the large display. Revenue trends looked promising until a new slide appeared. Several percentages failed to match the supporting documentation distributed earlier that morning. Melissa frowned. That cannot be right. She quickly checked her tablet before looking toward the analyst responsible for preparing the report. "Daniel, these operating margins are different from the numbers we approved yesterday." Daniel immediately opened his laptop. "I used the latest spreadsheet." Another executive compared printed reports with the digital presentation. Within seconds, quiet confusion spread around the table. Different versions of the same financial model showed different projections. Individually, each discrepancy seemed minor. Together, they completely altered the estimated value of the acquisition under discussion. Ethan remained remarkably calm. "Find the source," he said evenly. "We do not make decisions based on uncertain data." 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Analysts searched cloud folders. Executives compared email attachments. The technology team joined the conference call remotely, attempting to determine which version represented the verified financial model. Every explanation created another question. Every answer uncovered another inconsistency. Outside the private dining room, Naomi approached carrying a fresh pot of coffee. She paused politely near the entrance when she noticed everyone focused on documents rather than lunch. "Would anyone like a refill?" she asked quietly. No one responded immediately. Melissa sighed without looking up. "Please leave the coffee there." "Thank you." Naomi nodded and began placing cups around the table. As she reached Ethan's chair, her eyes briefly rested on one printed spreadsheet lying beside his notebook. It was only a glance, no more than 2 or 3 seconds. She continued pouring coffee before stopping almost imperceptibly. Her gaze returned to the paper for another brief moment. Then she stepped back. She said nothing. Ethan noticed the hesitation. "Is something wrong?" he asked. Naomi remained respectful. "Perhaps not, sir." She looked toward the reports. "It is probably nothing." Ethan studied her expression. There was no curiosity in her eyes, only quiet certainty struggling against professional boundaries. "If you noticed something," he said, "I would rather hear it than spend another hour searching for it." Several executives looked up, surprised that he had even invited the comment. Naomi hesitated for only a heartbeat. "I should not interrupt your meeting." Ethan folded his hands. "You are not interrupting if you are helping." The room became perfectly still again. Naomi looked once more at the financial summary resting on the polished table. Then, in the same calm voice she had used all afternoon, she spoke a single sentence that caused every executive to stop searching their computers at exactly the same moment. "I do not think you are comparing the same assumptions. I think you are comparing two different questions." No one spoke for several seconds. The only sound inside the private dining room was the quiet hum of the projector and the distant clinking of dishes beyond the closed glass doors. Ethan kept his eyes on Naomi, searching for even the slightest hint of uncertainty. He found none. She stood exactly as she had before, calm, respectful, and completely unaware that every executive around the table was now studying her instead of the financial reports. Melissa was the first to break the silence. "What do you mean by two different questions?" Naomi looked toward her with a polite smile. "I could be mistaken, but these pages appear to answer different assumptions rather than different calculations." Daniel frowned as he turned the printed report toward her. "Can you explain that?" Naomi hesitated. "Only if you are comfortable with it." Ethan nodded once. "Go ahead." Naomi stepped closer to the table, careful not to touch any of the documents. She simply pointed toward two separate columns printed near the center of the report. "This version projects revenue, assuming existing customer retention remains unchanged after the acquisition. The presentation on the screen appears to estimate revenue based on expected customer growth after integration. Both calculations can be accurate. They simply answer different business questions." Melissa immediately compared the printed page with the slide displayed on the screen. Her eyes widened slightly. "She is right." Daniel leaned forward, opening another spreadsheet. "Wait." His fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard before stopping altogether. "She is absolutely right." Several executives quickly examined the reports again. What had seemed like inconsistent financial data suddenly became perfectly logical. Two different analyst teams had built projections using two different assumptions, then accidentally combined them into the same presentation during the final review. The formulas were not wrong. The comparison was. Ethan remained unusually quiet. He had expected an observation. He had not expected precision. "How did you notice that?" he finally asked. Naomi answered without hesitation. "The percentages were not the first thing I looked at." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "What did you look at?" "The questions above the charts." She pointed toward the headings printed in small letters across the top of each page. One asked what would happen if the current customer base remained stable. The other asked what would happen if customer acquisition increased after the merger. When the questions are different, the answers should be different too. Melissa slowly lowered the report onto the table. We all skipped the headings. Naomi offered a gentle smile. Most people go directly to the numbers. No one disagreed. Ethan looked around the room. Executives who had spent the last 20 minutes debating formulas now stared at a single sentence printed across the top of the report, a sentence none of them had bothered to read carefully because they had assumed they already understood the document. The realization settled quietly over the table. Experience had not failed them. Speed had. Assumptions had. Ethan folded his hands once more, but this time his expression carried genuine curiosity instead of quiet skepticism. You recognized that in a few seconds while pouring coffee. Naomi nodded. Reading the question usually comes before solving the problem. Another silence followed, different from the earlier one. This silence carried respect instead of surprise. It was the kind of silence that appears when a room full of accomplished people realizes that wisdom has arrived from the least expected place, wearing a simple black apron instead of an expensive tailored suit. Naomi took a small step back as though the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. In her mind, she had simply answered a question, the same way she might explain a menu item to a customer or point someone toward the nearest subway entrance. She had no intention of becoming part of the meeting. She reached for the coffee pot again, prepared to continue serving lunch, but Ethan raised his hand, stopping her with a gesture that was noticeably different from before. There was no challenge in it now, only curiosity. "Would you stay for another minute?" he asked. Naomi nodded politely. "Of course, sir." Ethan glanced around the table before looking back at her. "You noticed something that 6 senior executives overlooked. I would like to understand how you think." Naomi smiled faintly. "I am not sure there is anything unusual about the way I think." Melissa looked up from the reports. "I believe there is." Daniel slowly closed his laptop. "Most analysts jump directly into formulas because we assume the framework has already been verified. You question the framework before examining the calculations." Naomi gave a small shrug. "Numbers are usually honest. People are usually careful. Questions are where misunderstandings begin." Once again, silence settled over the room. This time it felt almost reflective. Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying the woman standing across from him. The confidence he saw was unlike the confidence displayed during investor presentations or shareholder meetings. It did not seek recognition. It did not compete for attention. It simply existed, quietly supported by preparation and patience. "Where did you learn to analyze problems like that?" he asked. Naomi answered after a brief pause. "By making mistakes." A few people smiled softly. She continued before anyone could respond. "When you solve enough problems, you eventually realize that the answer is rarely hiding inside the loudest detail. It is usually waiting inside the first assumption everyone accepted without noticing." Melissa slowly nodded as though hearing something unexpectedly familiar. Ethan looked down at the reports one more time. For years he had encouraged his leadership teams to challenge assumptions, yet somewhere along the way efficiency had replaced curiosity. Meetings became faster. Deadlines became tighter. Smart people began trusting summaries instead of questions. Perhaps that was why an obvious inconsistency had remained invisible until someone outside the room noticed it. Ethan folded the printed report and set it beside his notebook. "Have you always worked in restaurants?" he asked. Naomi's expression remained warm but thoughtful. "No, sir." She stopped there. The answer was neither evasive nor inviting. It simply marked a boundary she preferred not to cross. Ethan respected it. He did not ask another question. Instead, he watched as Naomi collected the empty coffee cups with the same steady movements she had shown all afternoon. Nothing about her posture suggested pride over what had just happened. Nothing suggested disappointment that no one had recognized her sooner. She behaved exactly as she had before entering the room. As she reached the doorway, the youngest executive at the table spoke almost instinctively. "Thank you." Naomi turned with a gentle smile. "You are very welcome." She disappeared into the dining room, blending once again into the quiet rhythm of servers carrying trays between polished tables and afternoon conversations. Yet inside the private boardroom, no one immediately resumed discussing the acquisition. The financial problem had been solved in less than 2 minutes, but another question had quietly taken its place. Every person at that table found themselves wondering the same thing. If a waitress possessed this level of clarity, discipline, and insight, what story had brought her to a place where the world saw only an apron instead of the remarkable mind standing behind it? The meeting officially resumed, but its atmosphere had changed in a way no agenda could restore. The executives returned to discussing projections, timelines, and integration plans, yet every conclusion seemed more deliberate than before. People no longer skimmed documents. They read headings. They questioned assumptions. They paused before agreeing. Without realizing it, the The board had adopted the very habit Naomi had demonstrated in less than a minute. Ethan noticed the difference immediately. He did not interrupt. Instead, he quietly observed how one simple reminder had improved the quality of every conversation that followed. Nearly 40 minutes later, the acquisition strategy was finalized with far greater confidence than anyone had expected when lunch began. As laptops closed and folders disappeared into leather briefcases, Melissa gathered the corrected financial reports and looked across the table. I cannot remember the last time a meeting improved because someone outside the company challenged our thinking. Daniel smiled. She did not challenge it. She slowed it down. Ethan remained silent. Those words stayed with him. She slowed it down. In an industry where speed was celebrated almost as much as success, perhaps that was exactly what leadership occasionally required. The board members gradually left the private dining room, thanking the restaurant staff as they walked toward the lobby. Through the glass wall, Ethan noticed Naomi helping another server arrange tables for the evening reservations. She carried folded table linens with the same attention she had given financial reports only an hour earlier. No one watching her now would imagine she had just altered the outcome of an executive meeting involving a multi-million-dollar decision. She did not appear interested in telling anyone. She simply returned to work. Ethan stepped into the dining room before his driver could escort him outside. Naomi was carefully aligning silverware beside a freshly polished plate when she noticed him approaching. "Was everything satisfactory today?" she asked with the same professional warmth she offered every guest. Ethan smiled slightly. "Very much so." There was a brief pause before he continued. "You never answered one question." Naomi looked at him with quiet curiosity. "Which question?" "You said you have a degree." She nodded. "Yes." Ethan waited. She did not elaborate. Instead of feeling frustrated, he found himself respecting the restraint. She was not trying to impress him. She had answered exactly what had been asked and nothing more. It was a discipline he rarely encountered. Most people filled silence with unnecessary explanations. Naomi seemed perfectly comfortable allowing silence to exist. "May I ask what you studied?" Ethan finally said. Naomi rested the folded napkin in her hands before answering. "Decision science." Ethan blinked almost imperceptibly. It was not a common answer. "That is specific." Naomi smiled gently. "It is a field that explores how people make choices, especially when they believe they already have enough information." Ethan looked toward the conference room, where his executives had spent nearly half an hour searching for an error that had never existed in the calculations themselves. A quiet laugh escaped him, more directed at himself than anyone else. "That explains today." Naomi shook her head politely. "Not entirely." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "How so?" She answered with the same calm honesty that had defined every conversation between them. "Education teaches methods. Life teaches when to use them. The second lesson usually takes longer." Ethan stood quietly for several seconds after she returned to arranging the table. For the first time in years, he felt less interested in someone's resume than in the path that had shaped the person standing before him. Whatever story Naomi Carter carried, he was beginning to understand that the most important chapters had never been written on a diploma hanging inside a frame. After Ethan left the restaurant, the city seemed strangely quieter than usual. The familiar sounds of Midtown Manhattan remained the same. Taxi horns echoed between tall buildings. Pedestrians hurried through crosswalks with coffee cups in hand. Digital billboards flashed ambitious promises above crowded sidewalks. Yet his attention stayed fixed on a woman wearing a simple black apron who had spoken fewer than 100 words and somehow challenged years of assumptions without raising her voice. During the drive back to Whitmore Technologies headquarters, Ethan found himself replaying each moment of the afternoon. It was not Naomi's intelligence that surprised him most. He had met brilliant people throughout his career. It was her complete lack of interest in proving she was brilliant. That was rare. Almost everyone with exceptional credentials eventually found a way to mention them. Naomi had done the opposite. She answered questions only when they were asked. She never volunteered information to elevate herself. That restraint stayed with him long after the restaurant disappeared behind the traffic. The following morning, Ethan arrived at his office earlier than usual. His executive assistant, Claire Benson, noticed the unusual stack of handwritten notes beside his laptop. Ethan rarely wrote anything on paper unless he considered it important. "Good morning." Claire said as she entered with his calendar. Your first meeting begins in 30 minutes. Ethan nodded before looking up. Claire, could you help me find someone? She smiled. That depends. Investor? Candidate? Client? Ethan shook his head. A waitress. Claire looked surprised, but remained professional. Do you have a name? Naomi Carter. Claire typed quickly into her tablet. Would you like me to schedule lunch at the restaurant again? No. Ethan paused. I would simply like to know more about her background. Claire hesitated. May I ask why? Ethan leaned back in his chair. Yesterday, she solved a problem that 6 executives could not identify. I am beginning to suspect that I asked the wrong question. Claire nodded thoughtfully. Within an hour, she returned carrying a slim folder containing only publicly available information. There is not much, she admitted. She graduated with honors from Columbia University. Ethan looked up immediately. Honors? Claire nodded. Bachelor of Science in Decision Sciences. She also completed graduate research for 1 year before withdrawing from the program. Ethan quietly turned another page. Academic awards. Research fellowships. Several published articles in university journals. Recommendations from professors describing unusual analytical ability and exceptional judgment under uncertainty. None of it matched the life of someone serving coffee inside a Manhattan restaurant. Why did she leave? Ethan asked. Claire gently closed the folder. There is nothing public explaining that decision. Ethan remained silent. The absence of an explanation somehow revealed more than a lengthy biography could have. Successful people often displayed every achievement proudly. Naomi had allowed hers to disappear completely. Claire noticed his thoughtful expression. Would you like me to contact her? Ethan slowly shook his head. Not yet. He looked through the office window overlooking the city skyline. People have reasons for choosing quieter lives. I would rather understand those reasons than interrupt them. Later that afternoon, while reviewing another acquisition proposal, Ethan caught himself doing something he had not done in years. Before reading a single chart or projection, he carefully studied the opening question written at the top of the report. A small smile appeared almost unnoticed. Without intending to, Naomi had changed the way one of the country's most respected chief executive officers approached every important decision. She had not done it with authority, status, or recognition. She had done it with patience, clarity, and the quiet confidence of someone who understood that the quality of every answer begins with the courage to question the assumption everyone else overlooks. 3 days passed before Ethan returned to Hawthorne House. But this time, there was no board meeting, no presentation waiting inside a private dining room, and no entourage following behind him. He arrived alone just after 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when the lunch rush had faded into a quieter rhythm. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, reflecting across polished wooden floors while a few remaining guests lingered over coffee and conversation. Naomi noticed him almost immediately. She greeted him exactly as she greeted every customer. Good afternoon. Welcome back. There was no surprise in her voice, no assumption that his return carried unusual significance. Ethan smiled. May I have a table by the window? Of course. She led him across the dining room, placed a menu neatly before him, and poured a glass of water before asking whether he would like a few minutes to decide. Actually, Ethan said gently, I was hoping to ask you something before I ordered. Naomi waited patiently. Yesterday, I learned that you graduated with honors from Columbia University. She neither looked impressed that he knew nor uncomfortable that he had found out. She simply nodded once. Yes. Ethan continued carefully. I also learned that you left graduate research before finishing your program. Another quiet nod. That is correct. Ethan rested his hands on the edge of the table. Would you mind telling me why? Naomi looked through the nearby window where autumn leaves drifted slowly across the sidewalk outside. For a few moments she said nothing, and Ethan did not interrupt the silence. Finally she answered, because I realized I had started collecting achievements instead of understanding myself. Ethan listened without speaking. When I was younger, Naomi continued, I believed every accomplishment would bring clarity. Better grades, better schools, better opportunities. I kept moving from one goal to the next, believing that success was always waiting behind the next door. One day I realized I had become very good at reaching destinations I had never actually chosen. Ethan considered those words carefully. Naomi offered a gentle smile before continuing. So I stopped. Not because I stopped learning, Because I wanted to decide what learning was for. Ethan glanced around the restaurant. And that decision brought you here? Eventually, Naomi folded her hands comfortably in front of her apron. Working here pays my bills, but it also teaches me something that classrooms could not. Every day, I meet people from different professions, different generations, different experiences. Every conversation becomes another lesson about how people make decisions. Some lead with fear, some with confidence, some with kindness, some with assumptions. Ethan quietly laughed. Including me. Naomi's expression remained warm. Including all of us. There was no accusation in her answer. Only honesty. Ethan realized that was why speaking with her felt different from every executive coaching session or leadership seminar he had ever attended. She never tried to correct people. She simply invited them to observe themselves more carefully. A young server approached to ask Naomi a question about an upcoming reservation. Naomi answered patiently, encouraged the nervous employee with a reassuring smile, and wished her good luck before returning her attention to Ethan. He noticed the interaction immediately. The younger employee walked away standing a little taller than before. You have a way of making people feel capable, Ethan said. Naomi looked almost embarrassed by the compliment. People usually become whatever others expect them to become. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is expect something better. Ethan looked out toward the busy Manhattan street once more. He had come searching for the story behind an impressive degree. Instead, he was discovering something far more valuable. Naomi Carter had never walked away from success. She had simply refused to let success become the only measure of a meaningful life. For the next several weeks, Ethan noticed that the most important change had not happened inside Whitmore Technologies. It had happened inside himself. Meetings became quieter. Questions became more thoughtful. Whenever an executive rushed toward an answer, Ethan gently asked everyone to return to the beginning and read the original objective once more. At first, the leadership team found the new habit unusual. Soon, they discovered that fewer mistakes reached the final stage of discussion, fewer assumptions slipped through unnoticed, and better decisions emerged from conversations that were only a few minutes longer but infinitely more careful. During one quarterly leadership meeting, Ethan surprised everyone by writing a single sentence across the top of the whiteboard before anyone opened a laptop. Read the question before chasing the answer. No one knew where the sentence had come from except Ethan himself. He never mentioned Naomi's name. He did not need to. The lesson had already become part of the company's culture. One Friday afternoon, nearly a month after their first conversation, Ethan returned to Hawthorne House once again. Naomi greeted him with the same calm smile she had offered every previous visit. Nothing about her had changed. She still carried coffee with steady hands. She still remembered returning guests by name. She still encouraged new employees with quiet patience instead of loud instructions. Ethan realized that while he had been transformed by a single afternoon, Naomi had simply continued living according to principles she had practiced long before they met. As she placed his coffee on the table, Ethan looked at her and smiled. I owe you something. Naomi tilted her head slightly. Another cup of coffee? He laughed softly. An apology. She waited without interrupting. The first question I asked you was the wrong one. Naomi remained silent, inviting him to continue. I asked whether you had a degree because I assumed that credential would tell me who you were. I should have asked how you learned to think the way you do. Naomi's smile carried the quiet warmth of someone who appreciated sincerity more than praise. We all ask the wrong questions sometimes, she said gently. The important part is being willing to ask a better one next time. Ethan nodded slowly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the wooden floor, while conversations from nearby tables blended into the comfortable rhythm of the restaurant. It was an ordinary moment by every visible measure, yet Ethan knew it would remain one of the most meaningful conversations of his career. Before leaving, he stood and thanked Naomi once again. She wished him a pleasant afternoon, just as she did every customer who walked through the door. There were no dramatic speeches, no unexpected job offers, no public celebration. Naomi remained exactly where she had chosen to be, and Ethan returned to the company he now led with a little more humility than before. Sometimes the greatest education is not found inside a classroom, and sometimes the wisest teacher wears no title that the world recognizes. People often notice uniforms before character, resumes before wisdom, and appearances before understanding. But life has a quiet way of correcting those habits for anyone willing to pay attention. Long after that first conversation faded into memory, Ethan never again judged someone's potential by the position they held or the clothes they wore. He learned that true intelligence does not demand attention. Genuine dignity never needs to announce itself, and the strongest people are often the ones who speak the least while teaching the most. Because the quiet ones are never truly ordinary.